Inside the cockpit, the Air Force crew pushes the throttle forward. They've trained for war zones, but not for this. This is Kabul Airport, August 2021. These are the final hours before Afghanistan officially falls to the Taliban. As the plane accelerates down the runway, thousands of Afghans chase after it. This is an American C-17 cargo plane that is evacuating the last Afghans out of the country. These people know that this might be their last chance to escape. And in the chaos, some begin climbing onto the side of the plane. One of them is 19-year-old named Zaki Anwari. Just minutes earlier, Zaki was on the phone with his family. They screamed at him to come back, warning him that it wasn't safe to go alone, but he didn't turn back. Now, Zaki is clinging to the side of a plane, praying that it'll carry him somewhere safe, far from the Taliban. Just a couple months earlier, the map of Afghanistan looked much different. The Afghan government, with the help of the United States, still held control over all the major cities and highways connecting them. But the countryside was starting to slip away to the Taliban. And when the US began withdrawing from Afghanistan in May of 2021, the Taliban didn't immediately rush the capital. Instead, they had a much more calculated plan.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
Rather than going after Afghanistan's largest cities, Taliban fighters swept across the countryside and captured the country's key border crossings. The Taliban cut off these border crossings so that they controlled exactly what was coming in and out of the country.
Behind me you can see the Taliban fighters holding guns and who have taken control of the border security.
With the border crossings under Taliban control, entire cities and military bases were cut off. No food, no ammunition, and no reinforcements. The only way in or out for the Afghan military and United States was by air. Afghan troops that were trapped inside their bases without pay or food began negotiating surrenders with the Taliban just in order to survive. The defense grid was collapsing, and in early August, the Taliban moved in for the kill.
The city of Zaranj in southwestern Afghanistan has fallen to the Taliban.
For the Taliban, this is what victory looks like, as it takes control of the city of Zaranj in the southwestern Nimroz province.
Zaranj, a major trade hub right on the Iranian border, was the first domino to fall. When the Taliban rolled in on the afternoon of August 6th, there was no massive drawn-out battle. Because the central government in Kabul was completely cut off, the Afghan and US military couldn't send reinforcements into Zaranj. The morale of the local forces in Zaranj immediately shattered. Aside from a brief hour-long firefight between some local Afghan fighters and the Taliban, the city fell with very few shots being fired. Realizing that they were on their own, local officials and the residents of Zaranj fled across the border and into Iran. Taliban fighters casually drove their pickup trucks and Humvees through the streets of Zaranj. Immediately, they captured the government's compound, the police headquarters, and the local airport with very little resistance. They even marched up to the local prison and released hundreds of inmates without much pushback. In just a few hours, a major city in Afghanistan collapsed into chaos and looting, proving to the rest of the country that this could likely happen anywhere.
This morning, Kandahar, the birthplace of the Taliban and a former hub for thousands of US forces, is under Taliban control.
In Herat, Taliban fighters stand proudly atop vehicles once belonging to the Afghan army. Now, they are in the hands of the insurgents, just like much of the country itself.
Kandahar, Afghanistan's second largest city, and Herat were the next two cities to fall to the Taliban. The Taliban's strategy of closing off border checkpoints and highways was working perfectly. Running low on ammunition and completely surrounded, many commanders simply handed over their weapons rather than fight a losing battle.
When the Americans left our country, this disaster started. I'm not blaming the Americans, but Afghani President Ashraf Ghani. Because when the Americans left, the destruction of our country started.
Almost the entire map of Afghanistan was turning red, leaving one massive blue island, Kabul. For years, Kabul had built up the ultimate stronghold. Nestled in a valley and surrounded by mountains, it was heavily fortified and defended by the best remaining units of the Afghan army and even American soldiers. United States intelligence predicted that even if the rest of the country fell to the Taliban, Kabul could still hold out for months.
As NATO troops withdraw from the country, it's now up to government troops to provide security, but they face a daunting challenge.
As the Taliban swept across the northern, western, and southern provinces, their tactics were extremely efficient. Long before their fighters even reached the gates of a city, the Taliban were already infiltrating the personal phones of local Afghan police and military commanders. Using WhatsApp and text messages, the Taliban bombarded local commanders with the stark choice: either surrender your weapons in exchange for money and peace, or fight and face execution. Knowing that they had no backup coming from Kabul and that they were completely out of supplies, many of these local commanders immediately surrendered to the Taliban.
They announced that they had come to a truce, and the military commanders up top had decided to stand down, have their soldiers put down their weapons, give up all of their heavy gear, their Humvees, their artillery. They literally just left the cars running.
When the Taliban did enter a city, they immediately targeted local prisons. By blowing the gates open to the prisons in cities like Kandahar and Kunduz, they freed thousands of their most dedicated followers. The Taliban kept multiplying in numbers after every prison they freed. And with every surrendered Afghan military base, the Taliban inherited a massive arsenal of weapons. Taliban fighters were no longer just riding in pickup trucks. They were advancing in convoys of captured American armored Humvees, armed with M4 rifles, artillery, and night vision gear stolen directly from the Afghan military.
Taliban appear to fly U.S. Black Hawk helicopters over Kandahar. The Afghan Air Force reportedly had 167 operational aircraft, including 33 Black Hawk attack helicopters, before the Taliban took over. And there's a video, you may have seen it, of the Taliban literally flying around in Black Hawks.
It was, we're going to leave these weapons for the Afghani allies. It really was, but we're going to strip all their support out and they're just going to figure it out. And then the Afghani allies were like, no, we're not.
This combination of intimidation, prison breaks, and captured U.S. firepower created an unstoppable Taliban takeover. By August 12th, the Taliban captured Ghazni, a vital city sitting right on Highway 1. Capturing Ghazni was key for the Taliban, as this disconnected Kabul from the entire southern half of the country. Just 2 days later, on August 14th, the heavily defended northern stronghold of Mazar-e-Sharif surrendered without a major fight. The government's last true line of defense outside the capital had simply vanished. In just over a week, the Taliban had now captured over 30 of Afghanistan's provincial capitals, and now just Kabul was left. But before I explain how the Taliban moved into Kabul, I need to tell you about the company that helped make this video possible, Clover. You guys liked Clover so much the last time we did a partnership that they called me up and asked to do another. But in case you missed our first partnership, Clover is a finance app that lets you access up to $400 before payday. We're often in that awkward spot where we're just a few days away from getting paid, but something comes up. Maybe rent just went through. Maybe you have a random car repair. Maybe groceries are more expensive than you expected. Whatever it is, sometimes you just need a little breathing room. Clover gives you that breathing room. But the important part is that it's not one of those sketchy payday loan situations where you borrow a little and then suddenly owe way more later. With Clover, there's no interest, no credit check, and no late fees. And that's really the biggest thing for me. It's meant to be a simple way to access cash when you actually need it without getting pulled into some stressful debt cycle. So if you're ever in that situation where you just need a little buffer before payday, Clover is definitely worth checking out. Make sure to use the link in my description or scan this QR code to get started, and you can access up to $400 before payday with no interest, no credit checks, and no late fees. Thank you, Clover, for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to it.
3,000 U.S. troops are on their way to help with evacuations.
After a briefing with the President and the Defense Secretary, they are deciding that more troops need to be put in, 3 battalions of Marines and other soldiers, to evacuate American citizens there.
We believe this is the prudent thing to do given the rapidly deteriorating security situation in and around Kabul.
When 3,000 U.S. troops rushed into Kabul to help with evacuations, it sent a clear signal. Even the capital wasn't safe anymore. The illusion of Kabul being an untouchable capital had simply shattered. Inside Kabul, absolute panic gripped the streets. Millions of residents woke up to the terrifying realization that the war had finally arrived at their doorsteps. Families desperately tried to drive out of the city, but traffic became impossible to navigate. Meanwhile, thousands of others rushed to ATMs and banks, frantically trying to withdraw their life savings before the financial system collapsed. Rumors spread like wildfire through the streets that the Taliban would soon begin going door to door, seeking a brutal revenge on anyone who had worked with the United States, NATO, or the Afghan government. But while the citizens of Kabul were bracing for the violent return of the Taliban, the man tasked with defending them was quietly planning his own exit. As the Taliban completely encircled the city limits on the morning of August 15, 2021, the command structure of the Afghan government was secretly collapsing. Without warning his cabinet, his military commanders, or even his top United States allies, Afghanistan President Ghani made a quick decision.
Reported that Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani has fled the country as the Taliban have moved further into Kabul.
That afternoon, President Ghani, his wife, and a small circle of close aides boarded military helicopters on palace grounds. They lifted off into the sky and fled the country, eventually seeking asylum in the UAE. To the Afghan people, especially to the soldiers still holding their ground, this was the ultimate betrayal. The moment the news broke that the president had vanished, the Afghan government officially died. The remaining police and military forces in Kabul realized that it was over. They stripped off their uniforms, abandoned their checkpoints, and went home to hide. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, inside the heavily fortified United States Embassy, the Americans were in full crisis mode. The 3,000 US Marines and soldiers who had just flown in were no longer planning an orderly drawdown. They were executing a frantic emergency evacuation.
It's as bad as it gets now. Thousands upon thousands trapped. Behind them, the Taliban. In front, soldiers having to decide who stays and who goes.
Outside the Kabul airport, throngs still desperately try to get past the razor wire barriers. Many stand and wait in an open sewer.
Some parents so desperate they hand their children over.
Hamid Karzai International Airport became the absolute last speck of hope on the entire map of Afghanistan. Tens of thousands of Afghans flooded to the airport's perimeters, creating a deadly situation. Families were crushed against concrete blast walls and razor wire, with many forced to stand in waist-deep open sewage canals for days to get closer to the gates. While this frantic scramble unfolded at the airport, a completely different kind of chaos was taking place just a few miles away, back in the American embassy. The American military initiated an emergency destruction protocol. Thick pillars of black smoke began emerging from the building. Inside, diplomats and military personnel were frantically throwing highly sensitive documents into massive incinerators. They smashed computer hard drives with sledgehammers, shredded physical files, and destroyed classified electronic equipment to prevent anything of military or intelligence value from falling into the hands of the Taliban. The American flag that flew over the compound was lowered, signaling an end to the American presence in the country. The embassy was entirely abandoned, and a continuous stream of Chinook helicopters began transporting the last remaining staff directly into the nightmare that was waiting for them at the airport. As the helicopters dropped the final embassy staff onto the tarmac, the sheer desperation at Hamid Karzai International Airport had reached its boiling point. Thousands of civilians breached the runway and swarmed a massive C-17 cargo plane as it tried taking off. One of the people clinging to the side of this plane was 19-year-old Zaki Anwari. Zaki was an incredible football player who played for Afghanistan's national youth team. He was terrified that the Taliban would destroy his future and freedoms that he had known his entire life. While standing on the chaotic tarmac, he made one last phone call to his family. They screamed and begged for him to come home, but Zaki's fear of living under the Taliban was stronger than his family's plea. As the C-17 accelerated down the runway, the crowd on the ground was running after it. Zaki and a few others held onto the side of the plane, desperate to escape the country.
This video was recorded by a man as he and his countrymen clung desperately to the side of the cargo plane as it was taking off.
As the wheels left the tarmac and the massive aircraft climbed into the sky over Kabul, the unthinkable reality of their situation set in. With the hurricane-force winds now blowing at them, holding on became physically impossible. Tragically, all the men still holding onto the side of the plane ended up falling from the sky. Zaki was crushed inside the landing gear panels as the wheels retracted. His story became a heartbreaking example of a country's absolute desperation to escape. Despite the chaos on the runway, over the next 2 weeks, the United States managed to evacuate thousands of people. At its peak, a plane was taking off every 45 minutes.
This is the scene inside the U.S. cargo plane. 640 people packed on board for the 3-hour flight to Qatar.
As the United States funneled thousands of Afghans and their own citizens out of the country, just beyond the razor wire of the airport, the city of Kabul had completely transformed overnight. Taliban fighters, many of whom had spent the last 2 decades hiding in rugged mountains, were now the undisputed leaders of a modern capital of 6 million people.
Just showing you again those pictures from earlier of Taliban fighters behind the desk of the presidential palace.
In the capital of Kabul, Taliban fighters were enjoying the fruits of victory, using the machines at an abandoned gym, driving bumper cars at a fairground, and enjoying a carousel ride.
Aside from enjoying the amusement park, they set up heavily armed checkpoints at every major intersection and completely replaced the Afghan police that once roamed the streets. And for the US Marines guarding the airport, this created an incredibly tense standoff. They were essentially trapped on a single runway, trying to get the last Afghans and Americans out of the country, while they were completely surrounded by the Taliban, armed with the United States' own weapons. And because the US military was confined to the airport, they had to rely on a terrifying truce. They needed their enemy, the Taliban, to provide outer perimeter security and control of the massive crowds. But this massive, tightly packed crowd of terrified civilians created a perfect target for a mutual enemy of both the United States and the Taliban, ISIS.
The United States government is now relying on a terrorist organization, though not labeled that officially by the United States, in the Taliban to provide security against another terrorist organization, the ISIS-K, with which Taliban is at war in the eastern part of the country that it now rules.
United States intelligence agencies began intercepting alarming signals that an ISIS bomber was actively heading towards the airport. The US Marines guarding the perimeter, specifically at the heavily congested, narrow checkpoint known as Abbey Gate, were put on high alert. But with thousands of desperate people crushing against the barricades and standing shoulder to shoulder in the sewage canals, finding a single bomber hidden within the chaos was nearly impossible. Then, on the evening of August 26th, the nightmare scenario became a reality.
Good afternoon, and we are coming on the air at this hour with breaking news, and it's difficult. The latest details in the bomb attack outside the airport in Kabul.
You've now seen that we've updated our casualty list to include a 13th service member killed in action.
On August 26, 2021, an ISIS bomber wearing a 25-pound explosive vest packed with ball bearings managed to slip through the crowd and detonated his device right at the edge of Abbey Gate. This gate was the primary security checkpoint separating the chaotic streets of Kabul from the safety of the runway, meaning thousands of families were packed shoulder to shoulder in a confined trench with nowhere to run. The massive explosion ripped through the densely packed canal. In a single devastating instant, 13 United States service members and over 170 Afghan civilians were killed. It was one of the absolute deadliest days for the US military and the entire 20-year war, and it happened just days before the evacuation was officially supposed to end.
The day of the attack, we had gotten probably the most direct indications of a threat at the Abbey Gate and an individual to look out for. So we made sure that information was passed to our Marine snipers and to the Marines on location.
How difficult would it be to pick out one person who you have a description of?
I would say next to impossible. In crowds of thousands, tightly packed, shoulder to shoulder, chest to chest. I mean, this was a very dense crowd.
The bombing immediately shifted the reality on the ground. With the threat of more attacks looming and the August 31st withdrawal deadline just days away, the rescue mission was effectively forced to a halt. The US military permanently welded the airport gates shut, leaving thousands of desperate Afghans stranded on the outside. As midnight approached on August 30th, the evacuation mission had finally fallen silent. As the last C-17 plane lifted off packed with US Marines, the map of Afghanistan changed one final time. The tiny blue dot representing Hamid Karzai International Airport had finally blinked out, and the entire country was now swallowed in red. America's longest war was officially over. Despite the chaos, the US pulled off the largest military airlift in history, evacuating over 120,000 people in just 2 weeks. But after 20 years in the country, trillions of dollars spent, and thousands of lives lost, it ended exactly how it began. The Taliban is in full control of the country, and thousands of desperate Afghan allies were left behind to face a terrifying new reality. While the tragedy in Kabul was defined by a sudden mass chaos, trying to escape from the world's most heavily guarded regime is an entirely different game. Find out exactly how it's done by clicking the video on the screen to watch How to Escape North Korea in 2026.